Morning with great sorrow and great concern and an even deep alarm about the events that are transpiring rapidly in Iraq. ISIS, most extreme Islamist organization, radical terrorist organization, now controls at least one-third of Iraqi territory and is rapidly gaining more. The areas of Fallujah, Mosul, Tikrit, they're on the outsides of Samarra. With these victories, ISIS controls a swath of territory that stretches from the Syrian-Turkish frontier in the north down the Euphrates River all the way to the Iraqi city of Fallujah, just 40 miles west of Baghdad. And, of course, hourly, they are experiencing greater gains while the Iraqi military and police seem to be dissolving before our very eyes. ISIS social media published pictures of their fighters demolishing the sand berm which hitherto marked the border between Syria and Iraq, an interesting symbolic gesture. They also ISIS released footage of large numbers of weapons and armored military vehicles being received by members in eastern Syria, confirming fears that the looted weapons would fuel the insurgency on both sides, both Syria and Iraq. Sources in the city of Hasaka, the Syrian city of Hasaka, confirmed that large numbers of trucks, convoys of trucks carrying weapons arrived late on Tuesday and were met by a senior ISIS figure, Omar al-Chechani. General Keane, the architect of the surge, said, quote, "This organization," speaking of ISIS, "has grown into a military organization and is no longer conducting terrorist activities exclusively, but is conducting conventional military operations. They're attacking Iraqi military positions with company and battalion-sized formations, and in the face of that, the Iraqi security forces have not been able to stand up to it. The most frightening part is that ISIS strength will only grow after today. We use the cash reserves from Mosul's banks, the military equipment seized from military and police bases, and the release of 3,000 fighters from local jails to bolster its military and financial capacity. ISIS has now become the richest terror group ever, looted $492 million from Mosul's central bank. The governor confirmed Kurdish television reports that ISIS militants had stolen millions from numerous banks across Mosul. Most disturbing is the Iraqi security forces are collapsing. Kurdish and Shia militias are, to some degree, filling the vacuum. The story goes on, including the fact that the International Organization for Migration says that as many as 500,000 citizens have fled Mosul. There are reports of tens of thousands of citizens forced from their homes in other areas as fighting escalates across northern and central Iraq. And then the question arises, could all this have been avoided? And the answer is absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. Mr. President, I think it's probably the height of ego to quote oneself. But I think it's important to have again on the record what I said during this whole process when the President of the United States' only goal was to leave Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's about to make the same mistake in Afghanistan that he did in Iraq. And those of us who knew Iraq, who knew al-Qaeda, who knew how vital and how fragile the Iraqi government is, and the day that the President announced that all U.S. troops would leave Iraq by the end of the year, I said, today marks a harmful and sad setback for the United States and the world. I respectfully disagree with the President. This decision will be viewed as a strategic victory for our enemies in the Middle East. On October 20, 2011, nearly 4,500 Americans have given their lives for our mission in Iraq. Countless more have been wounded. I fear that all of the gains made possible by these brave Americans in Iraq at such grave cost are now at risk. On November 15, 2011, at a Senate Armed Services Committee, when Ambassador Crocker said it was a mistake, I said, and I will not give the whole statement, but I said, we cannot avoid the fact that Iraq's progress is now at greater risk than at any time since the dark days before the surge, and that It did not have to be this way. And finally, on December 14th, the day that the President in triumph visited Fort Bragg to mark the end, in his view, the end of the Iraq War, I said over 4,000 brave young Americans gave their lives in this conflict. I pray that their sacrifice is not in vain. Unfortunately, it is clear that this decision of a complete pullout of United States troops from Iraq was dictated by politics and not our national security interests. I believe that history will judge this President's leadership with the scorn and disdain that it deserves. And, of course, we now know that the United States rebuffed, according to the New York Times today, Michael Gordon and Eric Schmidt. The United States refused Maliki's request to strike against the militants. Strategic disaster assisted by withdrawal from Iraq. Iraq's terrorists are becoming a full-blown army. One of the smartest guys that I have encountered is a guy named Dexter Filkins with great experience. He has an article in the New Yorker, and I quote, "An extremist Iraq rise, America's legacy." And he says, when the Americans invaded in March of 2003, they destroyed the Iraqi state. And he goes on to say, the negotiations between Obama and Maliki fell apart in no small measure because of a lack of engagement by the White House. Today, many Iraqis, including some close to Maliki, say that a small force of American soldiers working in non-combat roles would have provided a crucial stabilizing factor that is now missing from Iraq. Sami El-Askari, a Maliki confidant, told me from my article this spring, quote, "If you had a few hundred here, not even a few thousand, they would be cooperating with you and they would become your partners." President Obama wanted the Americans to come home, and Maliki didn't particularly want them to stay. The trouble is, as the events of this week show, what the Americans left behind was an Iraqi state that was not able to stand on its own. What we built is now coming apart. This is the real legacy of America's war in Iraq. And if I sound angry, it's because I am angry, because during this whole period of time, for example, the Washington Post, an editorial this morning called the, quote, Iraqi, quote, success, I quote, Dennis McDonough, then Deputy National Security Advisor and now White House Chief of Staff, told reporters in 2011 that Mr. Obama, quote, said what we're looking for is an Iraq that's secure, stable, and self-reliant, and that's exactly what we got here. So there's no question that this is a success. You know, sometime we're going to hold people responsible for their policies as well as their words. To declare that a conflict is over does not mean that it necessarily is over. There's a great piece by Daniel Henninger this morning in the Wall Street Journal entitled "While Obama Goes." Meanwhile, Iraq may be transforming into A, second Syria, or B, a restored caliphate. Past some point, the world's wildfires are going to consume the Obama legacy and leave his successor a nightmare. Mr. President, what needs to be done now? Well, every hour, the options become fewer and fewer as ISIS, the most radical Islamist terrorist group alive, sweeps across Iraq and now, according to the latest reports, are even threatening Baghdad, that there are signs of further deterioration of the Iraqi military. What do we need to do now? Obviously, the first thing I think we need to do is call together the people that succeeded in Iraq, those that have been retired, and get together that group and place them in responsibility positions so that they can develop a policy to reverse this tide of radical Islamic extremism, which directly threatens the security of the United States of America. And it's time that the President got a new national security team. It's time that he got a group of people together that know what it is to succeed in conflict.